Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today's event. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to attend ODI's panel on Critical Minerals Race to Net Zero. My name is Dr. Rebecca Naden, and I'm the Director of ODI's Global Risks and Resilience Division and Head of the Global China 2049 Initiative. The Global Risk and Resilience team looks at new and emerging threats, and our risk-informed development approach looks at how we assess these threats and help decision makers understand risks, opportunities, and uncertainties in the options that they face. So I'm really excited about today's event. This is the first event in ODI's Geopolitics of Transition series, where we're really looking to explore different global and regional transitions that are shaping 21st century risk landscape and the opportunities across our world. As we look at the risks, we look at the opportunities, and we also look at some of the trade-offs these transitions create. So this is why we're thinking about critical minerals today. As we all know, the global demand for critical minerals is expected to soar in the coming years as countries transition to low-carbon economies, high-tech industries continue to grow, rare earth elements and minerals such as aluminium, copper, and cobalt will play a crucial role in the development of those electricity networks, EV vehicles, and renewable energy, and much more. But also, as we know, geopolitics is driving calls for diversification of supply chains, while climate impacts makes the energy transition even more urgent. But is there sufficient investment going to the mining sector to support the energy transition? And what are the opportunities that demand for critical minerals create for resource-rich economies? And what are some of the geopolitical, environmental, and social risks that countries must navigate? What are the different approaches that countries are taking to develop mineral resources and supply chains? So what we want to do today is really explore some of those questions and more in our panel discussion. Certainly, when we think about critical minerals and rare earths, the usual discussion in the West is about the rare earth race between the US and China, or China's dominance of global supply chains, and these minerals' importance to achieving net zero. Of course, all valid issues, but actually today we want to have a slightly different discussion. So first of all, our discussion will include looking at the opportunities and risks for resource-rich African and Asian economies, and the different approaches that these countries are taking to develop mineral resources and stimulate that investment into upgrading domestic value chains. Secondly, also what we want to think about is the role these minerals play in achieving a renewable energy transition. This is undisputable, but also we cannot solve one problem, climate change, by exacerbating environmental degradation on the other hand. So today, I also want us to delve into what risk management approaches and how changing practices for mining companies have evolved, and what that has meant for an investment, as well as hearing views from other geographies where critical mineral production is ramping up. So in terms of the format of today's event, we're going to start with some questions for the panelists, and I'm really delighted that we have such an excellent panel of speakers today to discuss some of these pressing issues. And then we're going to move to a more free-flowing discussion where we'll also encourage the audience to put their questions forward, and you can submit that via the chat function. So we really hope that you are going to enjoy what promises to be a very informative discussion. So when we're talking about energy transition and critical minerals, it's impossible not to talk about Africa. The continent is already a source of much of the raw materials, but as was the case across other regions, mining has not always contributed to their equitable and sustainable development. Today, many countries see the current demand as an opportunity to support diversification and move up value chains. Widely, there's a recognition that the conversation around critical minerals needs to change to create more value for resource-rich countries. And this is what we really want to dig into today. So whether that's actually happening or not, on what it will take to navigate the risks and opportunities to support development in countries and communities where mining takes place is something that we're going to explore. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce our first panelist, Silas Olang from Africa Energy Transition Advisor at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. So Silas is an economist, a development practitioner and an academician with over 30 years experience. And for the past 15 years, Silas has focused on natural resource governance. So he's well placed to engage in today's discussion. He's extensively engaged at the national and regional extractive industries governance initiatives and participated in many high-level consultations. He's based in Tanzania, so Silas can provide us with expert insight on how some of these issues surrounding critical minerals are playing out in East Africa and, of course, the wider continent. So, Silas, my first question for you is, what are the opportunities and risks of the critical minerals race for resource-rich economies in East Africa and the wider continent? And how are countries already capitalizing on these opportunities whilst managing those risks or potential trade-offs to support industrial development ambitions?
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for having me. And yes, thanks for a great question. I think we all know that any mineral extraction is actually a double-edged sword. On one hand, they play a crucial role in enhancing and enabling transition to a cleaner and more sustainable energy systems. But on the other hand, there are substantial environmental and social impact associated with the extraction and use of these minerals, but also the disposal of remains of these minerals. Africa, as you rightly pointed out, contribution in meeting the global net zero is quite significant. We know that the continent has like 2/3 of the world's, cobalt reserves, and these are in Democratic Republic of Congo, and about 30% of the world lithium reserves, partly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also Zimbabwe as the largest producers in the continent. But also the continent has over 1/5 of the world's graphite reserves, and these are found in Madagascar, Mozambique, and Tanzania, which will play a central role in developing electric vehicle batteries, storage technologies, and so forth. About 30% of the world's manganese reserves are also found in the continent. So the surge in global demand for these minerals presents Africa with a huge opportunity, as it is well positioned not only as a major supplier of these essential minerals, but also is an opportunity to attract more investment in exploration and production of these minerals. Mindful of the fact that these countries and Africa as a continent is relatively underexplored, considered, compared to other countries in continent like Australia. It is also an opportunity to increase in-country value addition and integration in the global supply chain. The immediate policy interventions has largely been, the restrictions on the export of raw minerals, addressing the challenges such as lack of processing capacity, which is a major bottleneck to further advance in added value midstream activities, and better returns can be made in this midstream opportunity. So this is one of the major challenges that need to be addressed, if at all, the export the export ban restrictions are actually will generate, the desired outcome. But regional coordination and collaboration is also key, but currently is relatively weak, and therefore targeting strategic partnerships at the global level are critical for Africa to navigate, the geopolitical complexity of competition, especially at the upstream mining, stage, and also processing capacity constraints, as I mentioned. The other opportunity is really generating highly needed green jobs for growing youth population in Africa, especially developing competitive supply base for the mining sector would generate jobs and lower mining costs for the transition. So it will have like a double impact. But the other one is also increasing revenue for financing critical sustainable social economic development, including the energy transition plans that are critical, and now many countries in Africa are actually starting to pursue the development of energy transition plans. So the revenues will be quite a useful contribution to finance such plans. But also increasing, export, which again will help these countries, improve their balance of trade. However, it's very unfortunate that the large amount of these minerals are found in countries that are already struggling with governance and high levels of corruption, and also constrained civic space. So the governance is critically important if at all these initiatives and this opportunity will be turned into reality for many countries in Africa. Therefore, together with such encouraging policy interventions, there is a dire need to protect the environment. Experience has shown that once prospectors discover reserves, and companies and governments are subject to strong incentives to develop them. And once the mine is developed, environmental protection is typically weak. To prevent, the environmental destruction, I think the government should establish areas of vast and valuable biodiversity in which exploration and extraction should be unlawful. This could be the way of tempering the incentives to undermine environmental social standards once extraction is started, and especially at this point where there is a rush to get the minerals out. Corruption risks are even greater when it comes to transition minerals. The past commodity booms have taught us a lesson that the spike in demand, as it is now, tends to unleash large waves of corruption. The promise of soaring profits and fast-paced deal-making increase the corruption risk appetite of private and public sector actors alike, while regulators actually struggling to keep up with that because of the weak institutional capacities. So making information available publicly about the mineral deals is needed to detect corruption and to enable informed dialogue about transition mineral projects and their impact at all levels, from national to community levels. There is also a need to build, from voluntary standards to mandatory legal frameworks that uphold transparency and integrity in the extraction of these minerals. I'll stop there for now. I'm happy to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silas. You raised some really important points. I mean, some that sort of leap out. I think very interesting your point on the need for enhanced regional coordination to help navigate some of these challenges. And then, as you rightly say, there's a huge opportunity here for green jobs, and the importance as well of some of the revenue generation from some of these resources to then go back into the country, which is absolutely critical to support energy transition plans. But then also, as you say, some of the challenges around governance and that need, I think, as you quite rightly point out, to protect biodiversity in all of this. As I sort of said in my introduction, there's a lot of focus, quite rightly, on climate change. But also at the same time, we also need to be ensuring that, for example, the Convention on Biodiversity and those other international and regional initiatives to protect biodiversity is also met. That actually leads us on very well to our second speaker of the day. I'd really like to now introduce Soad Chambizi, who's an ESG analyst at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Soad specializes in cobalt and has a spread knowledge of lithium and nickel. Prior to Benchmark, she worked in sustainability certification and environmental management, and has a bachelor's and master's from the University of Sétif in Algeria, and also a second master's in sustainable cities from the University of Leeds. So I'd welcome. So we heard from Silas about some of those challenges that both within the government issues such as governance and corruption, and then also, of course, some of the challenges that companies face in terms of investment. As we know, mining is a risky business, for example, operationally, financially, environmentally, and socially, as Silas pointed out. But from your experience, what are some of the environmental and social risks in the production of critical minerals, such as lithium? And how have the sustainability and risk management practices in critical mineral production evolved? And have they gone far enough?
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the invitation, Rebecca. So I think from like Benchmark's point of view, and based on the stakeholders engagements that we do, water from an environmental point of view, I will just break it by environmental, social, and then we can go to the second question. From an environmental point of view, water pollution and water scarcity is always a major issue. As probably some of the you know, that lithium is it takes a lot of water to pump brine out of the earth, and also for spodumene processing, which might put some constraints on community access to water. Also, water pollution is a very important topic. We have seen, for example, based on our analysis, only 24% of lithium companies, they have or they implement water pollution monitoring systems. So that shows the industry's commitments to these issues. Water pollution also will lead us to the question of better waste management, either wastewater or solid wastewater management. There is also a lack of that. Another very important topic is biodiversity threats, as Mr. Silas already mentioned. Most of the mining activities that are happening in the world right now are happening in either Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, or for the case of graphite, it would be China. And all of these continents or regions of the world, they have very high biodiversity, fauna and flora. I think the DRC has the second or the third largest rainforest in the world. Same for Indonesia, where 7% of the global supply of cobalt comes, and I think it's 50% of the nickel global supplies comes. However, we have seen a lack of implementation of or the lack of industry attention to the implementation of any biodiversity conservation efforts, both in as like for my knowledge, both in DRC and in Indonesia. For example, for DRC, there are a couple of academic papers and documented research that was found on the effects of mining, basically more for deforestation, and you all know what happens with deforestation. There is a loss of trees, a loss of all the species that live within that environment. For Indonesia, I think last month, our team was doing a site visit in Indonesia, and when they were flying, because the nickel, cobalt and cobalt is a byproduct of nickel, and these operations, they happen in islands in Indonesia. So you would need to take an airplane from island to an island to see the processing and the mining and processing factories. And when my colleagues were flying over the islands, there was like a gray area around the islands, which all that gray area is just from polluted water going directly to the sea without any measures of treatment. This is only for water, and you can imagine what would that do to the coral reefs there, to the very high biodiverse marine life in the region. So yeah, biodiversity is always a very high topic. I would say also greenhouse gas emissions. Although in our stakeholder engagement, we find that GHG emissions or carbon emissions are more of a concern for companies rather than NGOs, and especially local NGOs, probably because they think that the effect is still ahead. And for NGOs, they are more interested in like the immediate threats. But definitely there is a focus from companies specifically on carbon emissions. Probably if there is one thing that I want the audience to get from my intervention today is an environmental problem never stops at being an environmental problem. I will give you an example. An environmental problem, let's say you have water pollution. Water pollution means that there are toxic chemicals and solid metals that are going into the aquifers and into freshwater sources. And this has been already documented in the DRC. They found arsenic, they found cobalt and other chemicals in water in the DRC. And then you would have a community that lives like 5 miles away from that source of water, and that drinks from the source from those aquifers through wells. The academic paper found that there are people who are being sick from those toxics and chemicals, children born with birth defects, and because the people there, they don't have savings, they rely on day-to-day income. So in order to get treated, they need to they need to borrow money, and also they need to stop working. And then they can't pay the borrowed money because they are not working, and they enter into a poverty circle. And this is how usually poverty circles they occur in such environments. That stress from the debts, the lost health will add or will engender more social problems like alcoholism, abuse, self-abuse, and domestic abuse. So this is just an example of how can an environmental problem becomes a social problem, and probably further becomes a governance problem. Now, if you speak about other social problems within the mineral industry, I would say community development is always a high topic, hot and high topic. We speak with local NGOs quite a lot in Benchmark, and although there are, especially in DRC, although there are requirements from the government for companies to implement local development initiatives, I think for the DRC, mining companies need to invest 0.3% of their income in community developments, and this is aside from countries' investments in community developments. However, when we speak with local people, they say that some companies, they delay the financing. For one company, they have been waiting for the financing since 2021, and now we are at the end of 2023. There is also lack of community engagement. Communities are rarely consulted. So even when companies they do invest in community development projects, those projects are not the real need of the communities. Also, health and safety. Health and safety is always an issue in the mining industry, although health and safety policies and indicators are one of the best performing indicators in our matrix. But there's still a lot of work to be done on that, especially for artisanal miners. I'm not aware if you are, if you know the term, but it's basically, for our audience, it's basically people digging the minerals with their hands and with very rudimentary appliances. And we have had several NGOs claiming that there were death cases, unreported death cases, and hazardous working conditions on the on mine sites. What else? Yeah, so probably these are the main E and S, environmental and social risks that are around minerals extraction. How that is evolving with time, I think from an upstream point of view, mining and refining companies, there is, I would say there is an uptake of international standards on the policy side. However, in the implementation, there is always a lack. For example, I will give you an example. In our analysis, we analyze how many companies have resettlement policies, and only 13% of the companies have resettlement policies. From those 13%, only 40% they follow the International Finance Corporation on resettlement standards, which are considered as best practices. It's the same for UNGP, United Nations GP, guidelines on human rights. There is, like, companies in their policies, they say that we follow this, but when we look at the implementation side of things, we don't find any proofs that they have implemented the UNGP. This is a recurrent theme. I must say that in the upstream, mining and refining companies are lagging behind other industries, and they would need to do a bit better than this. This is not to say that not all companies are doing good, but like, we are seeing that the top companies are staying in the top, and the problem is with the bottom companies, bottom in the ESG sphere, and they are not moving as fast, or they are not moving fast enough to meet the challenges in the industry. From the downstream, I must say that there is a big emphasis downstream. I mean, battery manufacturers and EV manufacturers, electrical vehicle manufacturers. There is a huge push for certifications. I know that like certifications such as IRMA. IRMA is one of the most thorough and detailed mine certifications, and their board is 50% stakeholders, 50% corporations, so there is a fair representation. And don't quote me on this, but I think Tesla has committed to not, or to get mineral supply only from IRMA certified mining companies in the future. But I'm not sure of this information, but there's definitely a push towards a better ESG credentials for mining and refining countries.
Thank you so much. So thank you for that, really kind of informative outline for us, and also bringing a bit of the human element to some of these challenges. I think, as you said, you really want the audience to take away from your intervention this issue that an environmental problem then cascades into then becoming a health problem, which in turn becomes a social problem. So I think this really emphasizes the need for a proper, comprehensive understanding of all of those risks and some of the trade-offs, and how we cannot get locked into addressing environmental issues just in a silo. We need to understand what the implications of those problems are, and how important it is to have that holistic understanding, so that proper mitigation measures can be put in place. And I think also very useful that you outlined for the audience as well, some of the challenges in yes, you say the policy uptake's there, but the implementation, we see that across the board on a whole range of issues. But then also that difference between both upstream and downstream, with companies like Tesla and others, making commitments, but it's not uniform across the board. Thank you very much. So we've talked about, we've had some examples from Silas and Soad from Africa, but countries in every region, as Soad touched on, are looking to tap into the demand for critical minerals to support economic growth and diversification. And actually, one country that myself and the team here at ODI have been increasingly looking at is Mongolia. So a country, it's landlocked between two large neighbours, China and Russia. It's grown very rapidly in the last few decades and has experienced multiple economic shocks in the last few years. And in response to this, the government of Mongolia has adopted what it describes as the new recovery policy. And as I mentioned here at ODI, in the team, we've been looking at how the government can enhance the effectiveness of this policy. And the recent launch of underground operations at Oyu Tolgoi, the largest mining project in the country's history, which promises to support its economy by providing opportunities to reinvest in diversification. So I'm actually really happy to be able to introduce our next panelist, Fiona Blythe, who's the British ambassador to Mongolia. This is a recent appointment for Fiona. She was appointed ambassador in July of this year, and is giving her, a front row seat on as to how the country pursues this new economic recovery policy, and how Oyu Tolgoi is ramping up production. So Fiona previously served at the United Nations in Somalia, the Cabinet Office, the International Peace Institute, the Clinton Foundation, amongst other roles. So Fiona, if I could turn to you then, for my next question. Fiona, could you tell us a little bit about how the UK is working in partnership with emerging and developing economies such as Mongolia, but also perhaps in Central Asia more broadly, how they are capitalising on opportunities for critical minerals transition to support sustainable socio-economic development? And also from your perspective, what opportunities for engagement is the UK looking to explore in the region?
Yes, brilliant. Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for including me today. I thought I might just pick up a couple of points that you mentioned about demand, because critical minerals are by definition those minerals that are most important to a country's economy and whose supply chains are most at risk. And as you said, we're just not going to achieve our net zero targets without securing access to those minerals. A sort of quite a pertinent example here in Mongolia is that so far globally we've mined 700 million tons of copper in sort of human existence, and we're going to have to do the same again in the next 22 years if we're going to be able to meet if we're going to be able to meet demand for copper for energy transition. So I suppose that's a long way of saying that what the UK thinks is that one country alone can't do that. We can't act unilaterally. We need to address the issues that are facing us together, because we all rely on these mineral supply chains, and the supply chains are vulnerable to market shocks, to geopolitical events, as you said, to logistical disruptions, particularly felt here in Mongolia, and at a time when global demand is rising faster than the supply. You mentioned the impact of geopolitical events when we started, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've seen an acceleration in the pace of transition to diversify energy systems. That's putting additional pressure on critical mineral supply chains, and we expect that pressure to grow. China controls many of the critical mineral chains, supply chains. But I would say that's not all bad. Chinese investment has significantly reduced the costs in the renewable energy market. We all benefit from that. But it has also created some over-dependencies which make these global supply chains less secure. And China has market dominance on the supply and the demand side. And here in Mongolia, almost 100% of Mongolia's copper exports go to China. So just to say again that I think from a UK perspective, our sort of main message is that we need to work together to develop these secure and diverse supply chains. But also, as Soad was saying, we need to ensure that there's high environmental, social and governance standards. And we're a big supporter of the Minerals Security Partnership, which is a group of countries that are a group of user countries that are looking to raise ESG credentials, to build a diplomatic network and to really incentivize strong private sector support. So I'll just say a few words about Mongolia as well, because Mongolia has got, we think, deposits of copper, coal, fluorspar, gold, iron, tungsten, uranium, zinc, a long list of minerals. And it's also home to two of the largest copper mines in the world. One is in the north of Mongolia, in Erdenet, that was developed in the 1970s as a joint venture between the Soviet Union and the Mongolian government. And it's still a state-owned enterprise today. And the second mine, which is the one that you mentioned, Rebecca, which is Oyu Tolgoi, which is in the Gobi Desert in the south of Mongolia. It was discovered in 2001, and it is now being developed by a British Mongolian mining company, Rio Tinto. And that's a joint venture between the government of Mongolia and Rio Tinto. And it's Mongolia's copper reserves that are really kind of putting it on the map. There's an estimated 1 billion tons of copper in Mongolia, and the ore body in Oyu Tolgoi is thought to be about the size of Manhattan, just to kind of give you a sense of scale. But I think the mine is interesting for a number of reasons, because one of the things that the UK is trying to do to inject into this industry is more responsible mining. And I'll give you some examples of how Oyu Tolgoi is doing that, because Rio Tinto invested like $15 billion into the mine, and it's probably going to be like the third or fourth biggest copper mine in the world. But 97% of its workforce is Mongolian. The workforce reached about 22,000 at its peak. 22% of them are female. And there's a goal to have 50% female employees by 2030. And when it's fully operational, which is probably going to be in the next couple of years, the mine's going to provide really significant revenue to the Mongolian government, and it will probably generate about a third of Mongolian GDP. So the operation is making quite a big contribution to Mongolia's economic development. It's the largest taxpayer, it's the largest employer in the country, and obviously it supports, indirect industries from that. There's, over 1,000 domestic suppliers and partners as well. But as Soad said, there are risks to that. The mining requires, significant water supply, and in somewhere like the Gobi Desert, that can really divert water away from local communities. So something like Oyu Tolgoi, 85% of their water is recycled. They have a policy of zero direct discharge. There's no wastewater. It's all reused and reused until it's lost through evaporation. They've got a big biodiversity program, big cultural heritage program, and they've really invested very heavily in the local community, schools, roads, water purification. So that's an example of responsible mining. But as well as that, the UK is trying to support Mongolia to improve its infrastructure. You've got to get the minerals out. And you mentioned Mongolia is landlocked, and it has some really big infrastructure challenges. It needs better roads, better rail, better connections. We're also trying to create a more kind of stable, investor friendly business environment. There's going to be a new mining law passed at the end of this year, and it includes things like that are already underway that Silas mentioned about increasing transparency by putting everything online, reducing corruption by making everything digital. And we're also trying to reduce government interventions, reduce those state-owned enterprises. And we're advising Mongolia on how to reinvest those proceeds of mineral wealth that you mentioned at the beginning, to channel them back into the economy, to invest in the infrastructure that I mentioned, education, skills development, public services, rather than just going into the pockets of a few people. And a good example of that in the minerals law that's currently going through Parliament, 10% of the royalties of mines will go to the town government, and 20% will go to the provincial government under this new law. Just very quickly on Central Asia, we're working a lot in Kazakhstan, including we've just signed an MOU with the Kazakhstan National Geological Survey. We hope to do the same here in Mongolia. And so there's a lot of potential in the region, but I also just want to very quickly say about the challenges. 88% of Mongolia's minerals are exported without processing. Silas touched on the same issue in Africa. So we've got to think about how we work with the government to change that. It is landlocked, there are logistical challenges, and it basically means that Mongolia is just really vulnerable to those geopolitical shocks, including the closure of the border during COVID. And much of the country is not actually covered by modern geological surveys. Some Soviet studies, but nothing in detail. So in summary, we need to improve the security and the sustainability of the mineral supply chains. We need to diversify supply. We need to work collaboratively together. We need to build global capacity. We need to diversify the processing locations, and we've got to help create those kind of secure supply chains. And we've got to do that whilst raising the ESG standards. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to talk further about any of that.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Yes, I mean, you highlight some considerable challenges there. But I think, important point that both, as you mentioned, you and Silas have touched on, is this fact that, for many of these countries, these minerals are being exported without the processing. So how do we ensure that the countries can benefit from the scaling up that needs to happen, and then to ensure that those revenues are coming back. And I think a theme that is very prevalent that we can't escape from is this geopolitical risk. I think perhaps mining companies before, they would consider operational risks and of course environmental risks, but now it seems that on the top of the risk matrix is that geopolitical risk. So thank you, Fiona. We'll be coming back for some more questions to all the panelists to pick up on some of those points in a minute. But before we do, I'd like to just turn now to our last speaker. So I'd like to introduce Elena Borodina, who's Senior Transition Risk Analyst here in the Global Risk team. So Elena's work focuses on managing the risks and opportunities of geopolitical and low carbon transition risks. She's worked on Chinese investment in infrastructure and mining across Africa and Central Asia. And most recently, Elena has been looking at opportunities and risks relating to Ukraine reconstruction, including its plans to scale up the mining sector. So Elena, Ukraine, why has Ukraine been looking at scaling up its critical minerals? And an obvious question perhaps, what are the geopolitics of mining in the country in the current context of an ongoing conflict, war with Russia? And really, is managing environmental, social and governance risks of critical minerals kind of relevant given the fact that there is a war going on? Should we even be thinking about that at this point?
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I'll be picking up on some of the points, and I'll try to keep my intervention brief because I know that we also want to leave some time for the Q&A. For Ukraine, I think the first point I would like to highlight is that Ukraine has already been producing some of the critical minerals. So, for example, when it comes to titanium ores in 2021, Ukraine accounted for 6 to 7% of global production. And it was also the 5th largest producer of manganese and 6th largest producer of graphite, although production has decreased due to operational logistics challenges that had come with the full-scale invasion of the country. But Ukraine also has substantial reserves of critical minerals. I think some surveys suggest that it has about 20 of 38 critical minerals that the EU highlighted in its critical mineral strategy, and it has looked at accelerating investment in those minerals. Some official sources for all of the minerals are not available, but some Ukrainian researchers suggest that the country has about 500,000 tons of lithium reserves, and none of those are currently being mined. And also has substantial reserves of titanium among top 10 countries in the world, but only 10% of that has been developed, as well as nickel, copper, and other minerals. Ukraine has been looking to tap into the EU demand specifically for diversifying critical mineral supply chains due to its geography, but also its aspiration to be part of the Union. And it was also among the first countries to sign a critical minerals partnership with the EU. And activities around that have been ongoing, even despite the invasion, which I think shows real commitment from both Ukraine and the EU to continue the work and to position Ukraine as a potential supplier for the EU, but also as a prospective member country. So, for example, Ukraine is working on the new subsoil code with the EU that will bring the country further in line with the legislation of the EU. But I think there has been some analysis that suggested that Russian invasion of Ukraine was motivated by Ukraine's critical minerals and other riches, for example, in agriculture. I don't think that was the primary factor driving the invasion. I think there were other geopolitical and political factors behind that. But what I think is true is that if Russia gets its hands on and captures Ukrainian critical mineral reserves, many of which are concentrated along that shifting front line or in the adjacent regions, is that it can capture more of the world market. So it can control the prices a little bit more, but also it can undermine Ukrainian development, and that's something that the country would be looking to do in the future, because the war will finish at some point, but we don't know what the security arrangements would look like, which brings us to the question, what are the geopolitical risks of mining in the country? And I think Russia will continue being a security threat. It can undermine investor confidence, particularly in those regions that are bordering Russia, because there will be security threats associated with the country. But it can also look to destabilize the country politically. And I think this brings us back to the question of good ESG management, because one of the ways it can do so is if environmental and social risks are not being properly managed. It can look to destabilize trust in the government and undermine trust in Ukraine's fragile democracy. But also, if Ukraine doesn't see sufficient benefits come to the national economy and local economies, it can undermine trust in the EU integration process if Ukraine is just viewed as a hub for critical raw materials extraction and doesn't see benefits come to the local economy. So Russia will continue being a threat, but I think China is also the other factor, because China has been looking to tap into Ukrainian critical minerals. So it was trying to bid for Ukrainian lithium reserves, but it has been unsuccessful. I think the question is whether China is going to try to do that again, and what does that mean for Ukraine, and its ambition to tap into the EU supply chains, because the other driver, of course, is a trend for friendshoring. And we don't quite know how that's going to play out, because there is nothing that will stop Chinese companies trying to bid for Ukrainian licensing process, especially if those have to be open. I think I'll stop there because I know we're quickly running out of time, and happy to pick this up in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Elena. So we've talked quite a lot about some of the challenges, some of the risks. So before I open up to the audience to ask questions, I just had a couple of questions again for myself, for the panelists. Perhaps starting with Silas, and then the same question to Soad. You know, what is needed to enable energy resource-rich countries? What's needed to help them realize some of their ambitions around critical minerals? So, for example, you know, how can investors be encouraged to invest in developing processing capacity in producing countries? Perhaps if I could go to Silas first.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Rebecca, for a great question. Yes, I think that is a very important question when it comes to, developing local processing capacity. And yeah, I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, first thing is really to address, the kind of bottlenecks that exist in these countries to develop domestic processing capacity. Some of these bottlenecks are energy, because processing is necessarily an energy-intensive process, and most of these countries do not have adequate, energy to support processing. But also the infrastructure, poor infrastructure also act as a bottleneck for domestic processing. There is also a question of technology and skills. These are critical in domestic processing of minerals. Now, I think from economic point of view, the key point is how to address these bottlenecks in a way that would reduce, processing costs and still make these countries competitive worldwide. Because if the processing cost is higher, then the export of processed materials will be doubly expensive, and then they won't be able to compete with advanced processing countries like China and others. So that is very important to address. So I think the one way of addressing this is probably developing strategic investment plan, to address these bottlenecks. And part of the investment incentives that are incentive package that are provided to investors could also include, how to reduce, this cost of processing in country. But the other aspect is also integrating, domestic processing into a broader energy transition plans for the countries. And in this case, it would be useful, I think, to use the energy transition plan to mobilize global financing, which is part of the climate action financing. So yeah, mobilizing and developing energy transition plan and making domestic value addition and processing as part of the plan would enable attracting funds. And we have seen countries like South Africa and recently Senegal, developing just energy transition, partnerships, which is one of the mechanisms to attract, financing. And if local processing is part of that, financing partnership, both for private sector, but also for public financing, I think that would address some of the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Saz. Yeah, no, I think that emphasis that you put on that need to integrate plans is critical. We see time and time again different government ministries developing different plans, and there's no integration. But actually, that is just so critical. So I was going to come to you, but actually I'll just go to Fiona, because I can see some questions coming up on the chat that I will direct to you, so if that's all right. Fiona, perhaps just building on that theme of, how do we facilitate investment? Obviously you can speak from the UK perspective. Are there opportunities? Do you see UK businesses wanting to engage in the sector in Mongolia and Central Asia more broadly? Do they need to be incentivized more?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and really interesting points, I think, from the other panelists on this as well. I mean, I think it's quite pertinent because this week is Mining Week in Mongolia, and it's a big week organised by the Ministry of Mining, which is really focused this year on investment and attracting investors to Mongolia. I think that there's a lot of interest, and I think there's a lot of potential, which in itself is very exciting. I think there's some questions that investors have, quite rightly. Some of it is around mapping and surveying. I mentioned that before, and they're really, I think 25% of the country has got modern geological surveying, so I think there's more to be done in that space, and British companies can actually help with that as well, so that's an opportunity. Extraction, I think, is also an interesting area. I sort of spoke a lot about Rio Tinto's huge investment in Oyu Tolgoi, but there's question marks until you know how much deposits are there. Are companies willing to make those huge investments, and can you justify it without knowing the quantities? So I think that's why the surveying and mapping is particularly important. And I think that Silas's important points on infrastructure are really critical to realizing an investment. You can realize that there's an ore body here or that there's minerals here, but then how do you make that competitive? As Silas was saying, how do you do that in a way that doesn't prohibitively overprice the minerals in a global market? It's particularly the case, as I mentioned, in Mongolia being landlocked, but the energy requirements, as we were just saying, are absolutely huge. And at last, I mean, just also as well, this point about processing capacity, I think there's another big area there for companies to invest in. But I think the UK has got some specific technological expertise it can bring to that, consulting expertise. We don't have large smelters in the UK, so I don't think that that's something that UK investors will be looking at, but can partner with others who are. And then lastly, there's the kind of issue of legislation and regulation, which needs to be reassuring to investors to make sure that to make sure that they can realize their investments. Mongolia is doing a lot of work on this, as I mentioned, the mining law, trying to build investor confidence, trying to put in place those reassurances that that investments in the country will be secure. So I think it's all making progress. It's all very exciting, and I think it's quite future looking. It's quite forward looking, but there are undoubtedly big challenges that remain.
Yeah, no, thank you, Fiona. Yeah, absolutely. It is, an exciting time. But I think, recognizing those challenges is an important part, is a critical part of then developing a sustainable, both financially, environmentally and socially ways forward. That sort of also brings me on to a question now, another question from the audience. Soad, a question for you here. Michael says, you mentioned Tesla has signed up to only source minerals from the IRMA countries. Could you speak more about IRMA? Is it a robust enough mechanism from an ESG perspective?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Tesla was the company, but I know one of the biggest minerals consuming companies, they have committed to that, but I'm really not sure that if it's Tesla or not. But anyways, IRMA is, as I said before, is one of the most thorough and detailed certifications out there. It is a mine-specific certification, so it only applies to mines. It doesn't apply to refiners and the rest of the midstream and the rest of the supply chain. As I also mentioned before, the board of IRMA is 50% stakeholders, i.e. NGOs, and the other 50% is corporations. So there is a kind of a fair there is a fair share for everybody in the industry. It is quite a lengthy process and expensive process as well, and I'm sure I heard that some companies, even in the downstream, offer to pay for mines to be certified by IRMA, but it might have some gaps. But for the moment, IRMA is one of the most thorough and detailed and widely recognized ESG certification in the market for the moment. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Soad. So the questions are coming thick and fast now from our audience. A geopolitical one now. Perhaps I'll turn to Elena from this one. Elena, so the question is, what are the challenges of the energy transition in mining countries that mainly export minerals to China? As an example, a huge share of Peruvian copper export goes to China.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think that's a really interesting question. We know that quite a lot of countries are not really on track or even haven't started thinking about the energy transition, because in many of those countries, not all the population actually has access to electricity in the first place. But I would argue that when it comes to China, there is 2 points: is how to incentivize better ESG practices and more energy efficient practices in the mining operations. If there is no binding mechanism for them to do so, if there is no pressure from the government on them to do so. We know that Chinese state-owned enterprises, for example, and private companies behave very differently in countries where they go, and maybe more responsive just to the government pressure. If there is no such pressure to clean up the supply chains from the government, then that's a real challenge, because mining industry plays a big role in the economies of those countries. And I think the second point would be around the geopolitical exposure that those countries have to China, particularly if they send the raw materials to China for processing, but also if Chinese companies are the main investors, that can really shrink the space that they have when it comes to the foreign policy maneuvering, particularly in the context of geopolitical volatility that we are in.
Thanks, Elena. So we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to just turn to the panel one more time, and just get the sense perhaps from them, what's their kind of one takeaway that they'd like the audience to go away with, or do they feel broadly positive about this? I mean, we talk about the energy transition, but we know it takes anywhere between 1 to 14 years to establish a mine. It takes 1 to 4 years to set up a factory. How does the panel feel that the countries, resource-rich countries, are going to be able to capitalize on this growing demand in the near future? Or, as I say, just share with the audience what's the kind of one thing that they would like to take away. Soad, can I turn to you?
Yes, of course. So probably the main point that I already mentioned earlier about an environmental issue being escalated to be a social issue. ESG is not environmental, social, and governance in silo. It is all one part of having sustainable, ethical, and green minerals, and thus green batteries, and thus green laptops and green phones, and ethical laptops and ethical phones. It is all interlocked, and it is all dependent on each other. The other point that I would say is also look for implementation indicators. Many companies, they have policies, they say that we do this, but there is also you would need to look for implementation proofs on that. And probably the last thing for investors is the analysis that we do is based on companies' behavior. So and based on companies level, but investors should go a bit more than that. Probably an investor might like a company's ethos and they may disclose well, but realistically on the ground they might be subcontracting a lot of the work done on the mine. So investors should do site visits, and they should rely on audits, of course, good audits, not bad audits, but realizing that a company's level is a bit different than the asset level or the mine level is also a very important and key point in ensuring that the mineral is ethical and sustainable.
Thank you, Soad. Thank you. And Silas, to you, what's the sort of key thing you'd like the audience to take away from today's discussion?
So thank you very much. I think the key takeaway is that to be able to contribute meaningfully to achieve the net zero, it is a responsibility of each actor really to contribute to the same goal. But in so doing, governance is critically important. And we know the time is of essence. We still have quite short time, but the delays in the lead time from exploration to production is not only contributed by the technical challenges, partly is contributed by the governance challenges, including corruption, but also the lengthy and unclear policy and legal frameworks governing the licensing processes. And therefore, governance is critically important. But I just want to say also that unless we make the process a win for the communities, a win for the environment, we cannot dream of having a win for energy transition and reaching the net zero target. Thank you.
Thanks, Silas. Fiona, your thoughts?
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, just very quickly, my two takeaways I'm taking advantage is the first, that we need to work together to diversify supply chains. No country can do it alone, and we don't want to return to a situation where a single country we're over dependent on a single country or small group of countries for either the extraction or the processing of minerals. The second is that this has to be done to the highest standards, and you asked if I felt positive, and I think it comes down to a choice for mineral-rich countries. It's more broadly about what sort of country do they want to be. Do they want to be the sort of country that reinvests their natural wealth for the benefits of their citizens, protects their natural environment, and preserves livelihoods and the environment for the good of their people? And Mongolia can tell you tough lessons from earlier in the century about what happens when you don't do that. But I realize that's a luxurious choice for developing countries, and so we need to incentivize and support the right outcomes on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. Anna-Lena, final word to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. I would like to support what my previous panelists have said about the governance and the importance of following the right ESG frameworks, but also the point around the geopolitics of the new energy transition order that we will be living with in the 21st century. I think the assumption is often that there will be the end of geopolitics when we transition from fossil fuels. I don't think that will be the case, because new powers will emerge. The resource-rich economies can benefit from the transition, and also those that produce those renewables that we rely on. So I think we're yet to understand what kind of world order we'll be living with in the decades to come.
Thanks very much, Elena. So, ladies and gentlemen, that draws us to the end of today's events. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, I think for me, some of the key takeaways are, we can't be avoiding the geopolitical risk. That's a kind of key theme. As Silas so eloquently put it, we need to make it a win for communities and a win for the environment. Absolutely. And as Soad said, ESG, it's not E, S, and G in silo. I think that's really important. I think that came through quite a lot in the discussion. This need to have integration between strategic investment plans, domestic processing, energy transition plans. I mean, we are at the initial stages, really, of this global energy transition. We're going to need to scale up. And I think that means that we really do need, as Fiona and others have said, to really understand the risks. And by risks, I also mean opportunities. And we need to have a comprehensive risk management approaches. We cannot forget biodiversity and the importance of that in our quest to solve one problem. We need to really be thinking about that. And we need to be really thinking about incentives and financing, and how governments and companies, how the public and private sector can be working together on this. And we need to be really cognizant of the realities that we are dealing with in many of these areas, and not shy away from tackling some of those fundamental challenges, as Silas pointed out, your governance and corruption issues. Otherwise, we're simply going to be embedding further risks. So I would really like to thank our panelists for taking time to be with us today. Really, really grateful for your time. Also, a huge thanks to our audience for listening in. So this event was brought to you today by the ODI's Global Risks and Resilience team. It's part of our Geopolitics of Transition series, so do look out for more events coming up. We're working with change makers such as our wonderful panelists today across different sectors and countries, and helping to support the understanding of risks and hopefully minimize some of these potential trade-offs, all working towards building resilience in what we know is a rapidly changing and complex world. So please do visit the Global Risk and Resilience section of the ODI website for more information, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. But thanks again to our panelists, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.